Although there are plenty of plot holes in all 8 seasons of The Vampire Diaries, one of its most interesting logic flaws came at the very end of the series. It's obvious that the show wanted to end on a happy and conclusive note. But one of the hardest to believe aspects of the series finale was obvious. And that is, that if this world actually made sense, then Damon and Elena wouldn't have survived for longer than a month after becoming human anyway. The Vampire Diaries was always odd about portraying its leading characters as genuinely good people who may have slipped and occasionally committed murder, rather than just the protagonists of the story. So despite the fact that they consistently went up against much more powerful opponents, and oftentimes engaged in objectively morally abhorrent things, they were still meant to be seen as pseudo-heroes. But clearly, the introduction of the magical vampire cure only exacerbated the obvious issue that most of these characters didn't even have the option to become human again, because they had crossed so many people in so many horrific ways that it was borderline miraculous that they even managed to survive with superpowers, let alone as average humans. Thankfully, TVD actually acknowledged this when Catherine initially took the cure, as her whole quest to stay alive after becoming human again, when a ton of people were after her, was largely driven by the fact that she had screwed over so many people during her tenure as a vampire, that she had no choice but to flee for her life once she was just a regular girl. But their willingness to make a beloved antagonist look like a massive target didn't translate to any of the protagonist characters potentially running into these kinds of problems if they became human again. And although The Vampire Diaries was clearly trying to give the audience a vague but happy resolution for its leading couple, they ultimately wound up creating one final plot hole by implying that Elena and Damon had a long, fun, and relatively stress-free human life before finding peace in the afterlife. Firstly and most obviously, Elena becoming human seems to pose a significant threat to her safety. Because even as a human, she's not just a human. She's a doppelganger, and apparently, literally, the only living doppelganger in existence, after Amara and Silas's entire bloodlines were extinguished, save for her. Elena was a danger magnet from the minute she was discovered. So the notion that she would have been just fine for decades, after barely making it through a few years in the supernatural world as a human, is baffling. But even putting her super special doppelganger status aside, she is literally responsible for a whole-ass vampire genocide. Sure, it was Jeremy's hand doing the staking, but it was Elena's idea to kill Cole. Considering how many supernatural creatures seem to develop connections with one another, the notion that no one would be out for Elena's blood for some kind of revenge in the name of any one of the hundreds, if not thousands of vampires whose deaths she was responsible for, is absurd. Bizarrely and horrifyingly, despite over a century of abhorrent behavior, Damon's list of enemies likely wasn't quite as long as Elena's. But that's still not saying a lot. Damon has been incredibly reckless and aggressively cruel for decades. And quite a few people came calling throughout the course of The Vampire Diaries, hoping to pay him back for his terrible behavior. So again, the notion that he would be able to live a long and healthy life without experiencing any blowback for his vampire transgressions is ridiculous. And even putting aside the fact that so many people out in the world would want to hurt Damon personally, and that he would be incredibly vulnerable as a human, Stefan gave Damon his very own super special snowflake issue to deal with, in the form of the cure. Clearly, the show never clarified what exactly happened after Damon was cured. But if he lived the lifespan of a normal human being, then obviously he must have managed to keep the cure within his system for all of that time. Which, like every other aspect of Damon and Elena's happily ever after, makes absolutely no sense. The cure was only a significant part of the storyline in the last few seasons of the series. But another huge factor in Catherine's life on the run was that people weren't just after her because she's her, but also because she had the cure in her body. So why in the world would this not be an issue for Damon? Sure, knowledge of the cure is somewhat limited, so that could have possibly helped to keep him safe for a while. But there were plenty of supernatural beings who knew Damon as a vampire, so if they came calling and saw he was a human, that would have understandably yielded some questions. And it wouldn't take a lot of investigation to figure out that he had a handy-dandy vampire cure-all coursing through his veins at that very moment. Obviously, the show can't last forever, and it's understandable that the writers wanted to offer the audience some kind of conclusion that was actually conclusive. But both of these characters were murdered multiple times over the course of like 10 years in canon. And one or both of them had literal superpowers for most of that time. So how would they survive for an entire human life afterward? The series finale of The Vampire Diaries was a pretty obvious attempt to give the entire cast of characters their perfect Disney movie, and they all lived happily ever after, ending. But ultimately, it makes even less sense than Bonnie just somehow inexplicably figuring out how to break the Sleeping Beauty curse just in time for the show's end. The notion that Elena and Damon could have lived a long and happy life in Mystic Falls of all places, rather than in some sort of supernatural witness protection program, is absurd. And while Stefan's epic gift to Damon might sound very nice on paper, he might as well have been signing his own brother's death warrant. But what do you think? Would Damon and Elena have been able to miraculously survive as humans for an entire human lifetime? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.